Introduction.
In September 2020, RTE published an advertisement entitled "The Truth Matters" as part of their campaign to tackle misinformation online.
In the ad we see the archetypal skinhead character leading a violent and aggressive charge toward an innocent online user. The skinhead here is used as a signifier, and what is being signified in a tacit consensus is what is called the far right in Ireland. The image of the skinhead here is being used to connote aggression and to promote the idea that political dissidence as being a very bad thing. This essay is designed to examine the idea of the far right, neo-Nazi skinhead, and see if there is any truth behind the myth today. In this essay I will concede that there is very much such a thing as the skinhead neo-Nazi supporter found all across Europe and America, albeit in small numbers. But I am writing this piece to challenge the idea that there is this skinhead subculture at work in Ireland in our body politic. I do believe, and I will argue here, that there is no such threat as the so-called extremist far right at work in Ireland, and there are most certainly no skinhead characters at work in any political movement to date. The idea that the Christian conservative movement or right-wing nationalist movement is populated by fascist skinhead types is a complete myth, and this myth is being propagated by the government-funded NGO sector and our obsequious mainstream media outlets for a very specific reason: the bogeyman. It is worth noting at this point how the skinhead movement came about and developed from London, England, to spread throughout the West, and is today very much a robust and well-recognized subculture in cities all across the world. What began in the East End of London in the 1960s as a youth subculture that celebrated multiculturalism and diversity. In their mutual appreciation for the new music coming in from the West Indies, both black and white youths would dance together in the burgeoning small clubs around the city. Dressed to impress and no sign of trouble, the skinhead movement began to grow, and as it did, unfortunately, it began to garner attention in the mainstream media for all the wrong reasons. Through a number of successive and markedly different developments, the image of the skinhead in the eyes of the mainstream public became sour. In the deliberate work of the sensationalist mainstream media, the genre was sullied by images of violence in the streets and on the football terraces, and through the 70s the skinhead persona experienced its final death knell when it became infiltrated by a fringe group of politically active far right-wing nationalists. It was this shift toward the idea of hardcore right-wing racism in the late 80s that solidified the image into that of the quintessential violent and aggressively racist thug. The image we witness today in the opinions of most people in the Western world when it comes to the skinhead is very negative indeed. It is perhaps one of the most vilified and demonized movements we have witnessed to date in terms of subculture and youth. In an interesting move in the mid-80s, the British mainstream attempted to diffuse and make unpopular the notion of the hard man skinhead in two adverts on TV in the late 80s and early 90s. There was an attempt here to demystify and depopularize the skinhead image for the upcoming generation of youth. The authorities were bidding for an apostasy in the skinhead ranks and a low uptake in successive generations by softening the image and making it unattractively mainstream for the disenfranchised and frustrated youth. We will see how this attempt fizzled out and how today in Irish media in particular the myth is being hollowed out and misappropriated yet again to demonize a whole new set of innocent people in the nationalist movement. The politics. To understand how there is no threat of the neo-Nazi skinhead at work in right-wing politics, we can examine an anecdotal exemplar that was a demonstration to defend free speech by nationalist factions outside Dale Éireann on November 18, 2019. The skinhead image does make an appearance, but in a very surprising way. In the above photo, we see a person named Mrs. Doyle and her son Jake Doyle attending a counter-protest at the Dale on the day. They were there to represent Antifa, the notorious anti-fascist group that is known for violent extreme left-wing activism. Here we see them both dressed as skinheads acting openly in public in an egregious manner. I am arguing here that the way they dressed has a very specific purpose, and they planned for their antics to be photographed by the mainstream media. In a very underhanded tactic here, they are posing as so-called neo-Nazi skinheads and acting very viciously on a public street. This tactic was also employed at a nationalist demonstration defending free speech outside the Department of Justice offices on the 1st of November 2019, where we found yet again an Antifa member adorning the skinhead image. This was done, I believe, so the mainstream journalists in attendance could write about violence at the right-wing protest and blazon their pages with photos of the skinhead acting egregiously for effect. The journalists will continue to mention far-right extremism in the article, all the while failing to mention that the photograph is actually of members of Antifa to propagandize the message that there is a problem with far-right extremism in Ireland. I don't believe there could be any other reason why an avowed left-wing anti-fascist would dress as an archetype of their opposites. This is how the myth is being propagated by the media. To reinforce the idea that the government-funded mainstream media and NGO sector are bolstering this myth, I will now turn to the work of Aoife Gallagher. She is a left-wing journalist for the Sunday Mirror newspaper and is on the payroll of a government-funded NGO, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, that tackles misinformation online. She has also worked for the Storeful organization that was set up to monitor far-right activity online. In an online interview centered around the idea of conspiracy theories, she is found giving the following quote at 26 minutes into the interview. Earlier in the year, when that anti-lockdown protest got violent at the top of Grafton Street, there was this immediate sense within this community to blame Antifa for the violence. It's kind of mind-blowing really to see how those kind of narratives spread so easily and how people just buy into them. I would argue here that this is a deliberate attempt to gaslight the audience into thinking that there is no actual problem with violence from the far left, and that it appears commonplace to think that any violence happening at nationalist demonstrations happen at the hands of these so-called far-right extremists. I can clarify here by experience that this is very untrue. I have myself attended a good number of these protests with nationalists over the past number of years and have found zero evidence for this premise. At all of the rallies I have witnessed, I have never seen any nationalist instigate violence. I have, however, witnessed many times the Antifa far-left faction behaving very viciously in a harassing manner toward the innocent men, women and children attending nationalist demonstrations. A number of times I have seen how Antifa would engage in fracas with the Gardaí trying to break Garda lines to do violence to nationalists, and I have seen how the mainstream media often writes articles reporting the violence while failing to mention who instigated it. So, I would contend Mrs. Gallagher's claims here and espouse it is a conspiracy to think the far-right are in general responsible for violent actions at nationalist protests. Conclusion. As I have given an anecdotal example above, I will contend that the idea of the far-right neo-Nazi skinhead is very much a myth on the streets of Dublin, and any concerns about this mythological, far-right extremist is unfounded and being dishonestly propagated by people who have a very vested financial interest in pushing the narrative in the mainstream media. It is a device that serves the ruling government well, and the authorities are eager to keep this myth present in the minds of the ordinary voter. It is being used to stifle the numbers supporting actual patriotic nationalistic political parties by labeling them far-right, and it does so by scaring the potential supporters away for fear of being called a neo-Nazi fascist in public. I now conclude this essay by pointing out and making very clear that the myth of the skinhead is being misused by our authorities, and how there is no bogeyman of the far-right at work in Ireland. If there is genuinely any person actually adhering to neo-Nazi political beliefs, then they are in a very minuscule and ostracized minority. So much so that they pose zero threat to the stability of Irish political society to date, and any attempt to fuel the fervours behind this premise is nothing more than media gaslighting and a travesty to the idea of an open and honest democratic society. The skinhead myth is very much alive today in the minds of the general public for all the wrong reasons, and it is my hope that someday this myth will be corrected. As it stands, in our mainstream media today, there is a travesty happening with the misinformation and downright dishonesty being foisted upon the Irish nation. It is an insult to the idea of honest journalism, and only time will reveal the truth of its effects on our nation to date. References.